We shall now proceed with our exclusive insight session on reviving the spirit of arbitration, bridging tradition and modernity in Islamic legal thought. We are privileged to have Yang Berbahagia, Dato Dr. Afifi Al-Akiti, to share his knowledge on this topic. Allow me to give a brief introduction of Dr. Afifi. Dato Dr. Afifi is the Kuwait Fellow at the Oxford Centre for Islamic Studies and lectures at the Faculty of Theology at the Oxford University's oldest faculty. He is the first ever Malaysian to be appointed to such a position in this world-famous university. His areas of expertise are Islamic theology, law, finance and science. In fact, in 2024, he was appointed by the Conference of Rulers in Malaysia to be a member of the National Islamic Council, and in the same year, he was elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts in Britain. Since 2010, Dato Dr. Afifi has been listed in the Muslim 500 and the world's 500 most influential Muslims. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Dato Dr. Afifi. Dato, the floor is yours.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrafil anbiya wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajmain. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Excellency Dr. Omar Hosseini, Secretary General of the OIC's Arbitration Center, Hadirin wa Hadirat, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's a great pleasure to be invited today to speak on a bit of the so-called exclusive insights that I have been asked to reflect on. Particularly, this is the first time that I've ever even realized that there is an arbitration center, particularly one that is in fact, that focuses on the Islamic tradition. And it's very interesting, partly because generally in the legal fraternity in the world itself, arbitration is not something that is in fact the norm, right? And in fact, in modern dictionaries, when we come to arbitration, it is usually defined as a form of alternative dispute resolution, ADR, this is what lawyers call this, where a neutral third party, the arbitrator or the mediator, and in the Muslim tradition they are called the hakam, and arbitration is defined as tahkim, as the minister mentioned earlier. And this is where the neutral third party, the hakam, makes a binding decision on a dispute after hearing the two parties, the two conflicting parties. So in many respects, that modern definition of arbitration, in arbitration tahkim being a form of ADR, what we call an alternative, it's not the conventional, it's an alternative dispute resolution, is interesting. So we need to ask ourselves, why is this not even part of the conventional system? This is in fact an alternative dispute resolution. And one of the origins of this, interestingly enough, particularly given the fact that the Asian International Arbitration Center has made its mission, if you like, to focus on what is actually called Islamic arbitration, and what is defined as Islamic arbitration is indeed tahkim. And that is because historically within the history of world civilization, it is in the Islamic tradition that made arbitration famous. And that belies the fact that the Quran, the Holy Quran itself, specifically mentions it in one of the most famous verses in the Quran, and this is chapter 4, Surah An-Nisa, verse 35. And this is usually a verse that refers to the sorts of arbitration, the sort of mediation that one needs to do when we have conflict resolution that needs to be done, particularly in a family setting. And the amazing thing about this dispute resolution is that whenever we always have conflicts and disputes, it begins with the family. And interestingly enough, if you think about this, if you make tafakkur over this, if you reflect on this, almost every single conflict in the world, even to what we find, even at the most serious threshold we see today, for example, with Gaza, right? And the Israelis, this is a form of a conflict that is a result of a family conflict. After all, Jews and Muslims are actually related in that they are supposed to be our distant cousins in that sense. But it is with family disputes that we find the most intractable, the most difficult ones to resolve, because they can be very sensitive and, unfortunately, very emotional. For those reasons, the alternative dispute resolution, the ADR, comes down to the need to arbitrate and to mediate, rather than going to an open court in a litigation, for instance. For those very reasons, we find the very famous verse, chapter 4, verse 35 of the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ شِكَاكَ بَيْنَهِمَا, right? If you anticipate a dispute between the two parties, فَبْعَثُوا حَكَمًا مِنْ أَهْلِهِ وَحَكَمًا مِنْ أَهْلِهَا, then appoint an arbitrator, then appoint a mediator from one party and another from the other party. And just look at the language that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used in the Quran here, very specific. The hakam is there, right? The arbitrator, the mediator. And in yurida islaha yuwafiqillahu bainahuma. And if they, the two parties, desire reconciliation, then God, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Almighty, will restore harmony between the two parties. I mean, it's an amazing verse, mashallah, of the Holy Quran. This foundational verse. If you anticipate a dispute between two parties, then appoint a mediator from the one party and from another party. And if they so desire reconciliation, then God will restore harmony between the two parties. Inna Allaha kana aliman khabira. Surely God is all-knowing and all-aware. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's very interesting if you look at the philosophy behind this. Arbitration, tahkim, is, an alternative dispute. It's a form of an alternative dispute resolution. It's not conventional. Why? Because of those sensitive, emotional elements that happen, usually that we find in family conflicts. And this is why the classical Muslim jurists then define tahkim, arbitration, Islamic arbitration, as what? At-tahkimu aqdu ghairi lazimin li kulli min al-tarafaini al-muhtakimin wal-hakami. A very simple definition. Right? That arbitration is a non-binding contract. It is a voluntary contract. It is a willing contract between which the two disputing parties enter into that seek resolution, wal hakami, and the mediator and the arbitrator or arbitrators or mediators. So this is why it's interesting when we want to revive the spirit of arbitration and wanting to bridge tradition, in this case the Islamic tradition, where the whole tradition of arbitration originally comes from that famous verse of the Quran, chapter 4, verse 35, and translate this into practice to bridge between tradition and modernity in Islamic legal thought. So I just wanted to this morning, I know that we have a full day of conference, mashallah, but to just set that tone for the next panel and panels, to look at just some of these interesting legal examples that were kind of very famous in the Muslim tradition. And I can think of a number. Let's start with the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, himself. I mean, did you know that before he became the Prophet, when he was at the age of 35, before he became a prophet at the age of 40. And there was the Kaaba, the black stone, the famous black Kaaba in Mecca that we have in mind today, suffered from a fire and flooding, and so basically it was pretty much destroyed. And this first example that I'm going to give you is what the ulama call the Kaaba arbitration. Why? And it was quite interesting that during that year, I think it was, according to the historians, around 603 AD or so, or 605, I may get my year wrong. Apparently the Byzantine emperor commissioned one of the churches in Abyssinia to be restored. And so they sent a ship from Arabia with marbles and iron and so on and so forth. But that ship ran aground off the coast of Jeddah, which is near Mecca. So when that happened, the Meccans then went to help, but then they realized there's an opportunity, that there were these wood lying around, and they could use this wood to restore the Kaaba in Mecca. Hence a mission was then done, so that they brought the wood and the foreman, if you like, the engineer equivalent, to restore the Kaaba. What originally was intended by the Roman Christian emperor to restore one of the churches in Abyssinia became a restoration case for the Kaaba. And at that time, no Muslims yet, of course. So they went to Mecca and they were basically trying to fix the Kaaba. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, before he became a prophet at that time, of course, was working to try and rebuild and restore the Kaaba, helping his uncle Abbas radiallahu anhu. And then when things were kind of done, you get the kind of the Kaaba in shape, finally there is this most important part of the Kaaba that needs to be put on. If you like, the capstone on the pyramid, the thing that defines the whole thing, which is the black stone, the Hajarul Aswad. Right? Where there is a famous hadith of the Prophet, it says, Al-Hajarul Aswad yaminullah fil ard, that the black stone is God's right hand on earth. So we must not be literalist Muslims, I hope, and interpret this. This is one of those famous hadith that needs to be interpreted. One of the more literal-minded jurists, Imam Ibn Hanbal, for example, who technically usually would interpret this hadith according to many of the ulama. So a reminder that the path to extremism in Islam is when you become literally minded. So let us keep away from that. So this black stone is the thing that defines the Kaaba that we see today in one of the corners of the Kaaba. And then they had a major dispute. As I said, if it's a family dispute, it's even worse. It becomes very emotional. And there are these four chieftains, clans, 4 major clans of the Quraysh who really wanted to have the honor to put the black stone up. And in fact, they even went to one point in order to have this alternative dispute resolution by fighting, to see who wins, and then they put the stone up. Until Abu Umayyah ibn Mughira, one of the leaders of the Meccans, then suggested, well, why don't we kind of, the equivalent of drawing lots, let's see who comes through that door of the Kaaba called the Bani Shu'aibah door, the gate of Bani Shu'aibah. Whoever the first person comes in will get him to put the stone up, something like that. So they kind of grudgingly, but not so sure, accepted this. And lo and behold, suddenly, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, passed through that gate. And you know what they said? And it's very famous in the history books. They say, Hada al-Amin, Radina, Hada Muhammad, in Arabic. So Miss is not here, she doesn't have to speak Arabic, but there you go. That is the trustworthy one, Al-Amin. You see, the Prophet of Islam, before he became even a prophet, had this famous reputation of being the trustworthy one. And this is, if you like, his career, being a merchant, required him to be not only trustworthy, but in this particular case, he became one of the famous arbiters, an arbitrator, a mediator. Because they see him as the trustworthy one. That is Muhammad. Yes, we all agree. We are fine with him. He's a just man. We can trust in his judgment, therefore. That's why the definition of Islamic arbitration, tahkim, is aqdu ghairi lazimin. It is a willing contract. It is a non-binding contract that these parties enter into. So if they agree to do that, of course, the resolution, the resolution has to be binding. You know, they have to agree to that until the point of the arbitrator makes a judgment of the dispute. So Muhammad came in and they agreed this is the best person to, you know, the neutral party. This is the third party neutral person that we can accept. Radina, we accept. So he came, and you know what the Prophet did? He took out his mantle, basically a cloth, square, and then put the stone in the middle of the cloth, and he asked for the 4 leaders of the Quraysh, the 4 chieftains, you know, the 4 bosses. This is like, they're sorry to say this, but we can say this in the class, mafia bosses, you know, kind of, the 4 bosses of the 4 corners of Makkah. And they all carried the mantle with the stone in the middle, and they brought to the side of the Kaaba, and then the Prophet, peace be upon him, settled the stone onto that side. MashaAllah, and that was how that dispute resolution was settled. And everybody agreed by consensus. Of course, the very person who suggested Muhammad, Hadha Muhammad, Radina, you know, Hadha Al-Amin, that person is trustworthy, that person is Muhammad, we accept for him to be the arbitrator. Abu Umayyah ibn Mughirah later became a great enemy of the Prophet, of course, who rejected his own message, the Prophet's message. That's another story. But amazing. That is an example of why the Quran says, why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, if you anticipate a dispute between 2 parties, then appoint, you know, arbitrators basically. And if they really truly want to reconcile with each other, then God will restore, you know, harmony between them. Indeed, God, surely God is all-knowing and all-aware. Amazing verse of the Quran. Another example is the example of the second caliph of Islam, Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu. I'll never forget. He was the caliph, Amirul Mu'mineen. And he was test driving, in those days, not a car, but a horse. And when he was test riding this horse, he basically made the horse's legs, you know, broken or something like that. So he damaged goods. So of course, there's a dispute with the owner of the horse. So what did the Amirul Mu'mineen, the Caliph, the Sultan of the Muslims at that time, the leader of them, he said to the owner, he said, okay, you choose anyone whom you trust to make judgment on this, to arbitrate, to mediate, to, you know, to come up with a resolution. Tahkim, the word tahkim there, very interesting, full of meaning here. And so this man chose Shariah radiallahu anhu. He was a famous tabi'in, by the way. A tabi'in is defined as a follower of the disciple of the Prophet. Not a disciple of the Prophet, but a follower. Although it is said that he became a believer of Prophet Muhammad while the Prophet Muhammad was alive when he was in Yemen, but he never met the Prophet. So therefore he's defined as a follower, a tabi'in, not a sahaba, not a sahabi. But this was during the time of Omar, you know, more than 10 years after the Prophet passed away already. And he was made actually a judge by Omar, some said Abu Bakr radiallahu anhum, you know, in Kufa, a city in today's Iraq, in the south of Iraq. And he was known to be a very just judge. So he was asked to judge on this, to mediate and to arbitrate. And you know what he said? He came out with one of these most fascinating Arabic put-downs. You know, he said, the judge said, you know, Shariah, he's known as Shariah Al-Qadi sometimes in the books. And he said, Khud bima ita'ata, he said, take, he said in his judgment to Omar and this other person who owned the horse, take, O Amir al-Mu'mineen, the commander of the faithful, take what you have bought and basically pay the full price for what you've actually bought, you know, or he said, leave it back, give it back to the person, bima akhadta, with what you've actually taken, or give it back to him, return the goods undamaged to the owner. Of course, Omar can't fix the leg, so that is the judgment. He has to pay for the full price of the horse. And that is an amazing example, where in order for you to arbitrate, this is one of the unique qualities of arbitration compared to a common or usual litigation. You can choose your judge. You can choose who you want to arbitrate for. You can choose the mediator. This is one of the reasons why, one of the advantages of the Islamic arbitration supposedly is that you can choose your judges, number one. Number two, the other advantage is what? It is supposed to be a fast process, faster process than a typical litigation. And of course, the last and third advantage is over a typical litigation is what? It's possible for you to do this confidentially, as in the case of Omar here, by the way. And of course, it became known later because he wanted it to be known so that people know about it. Unlike in open court, in litigation cases, of course, it's an open court process. Whereas in this case, confidentiality is assured. So I hope these are the very qualities that any Islamic Arbitration Center, whether the OIC Arbitration Center or here in the Asian International Arbitration Center, really do make sure that we have those in our DNAs. And the final one that I will finish with is the example, probably the most famous and controversial example of arbitration in the whole history of Islam, the case of the civil war between the fourth caliph, Ali, Imam Ali Karamallahu Wajhah, and Khalifah Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, the fifth caliph of Islam. And you can read all about this, ask Google about the civil war. Of course, famously, they came to a stalemate between this. This is the famous Muslim Game of Thrones, by the way. Example, where you have the reigning caliph, the leader of the Muslims. There was a civil war with the governor of Damascus, Muawiyah. They fought to a stalemate. And when they reached the stalemate, Muawiyah, of course, then suggested to the caliph that, okay, let us arbitrate. And mashallah, the caliph agreed to arbitrate, following the Quran, following what the Prophet did, for example, as in his examples. And what they did is they chose their judges. So Imam Ali Karamallahu chose Abu Musa Al-Ashari radiallahu anhu, one of the companions of the Prophet, and Muawiyah radiallahu anhu chose Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhu to arbitrate between the two of them. And so they had their meetings and so on and so forth, you know. And of course, then they decided, in order to, because this is a huge example where if the Muslims didn't get it right, even though by that time they've basically conquered Persia and the whole half of the Roman Empire. This is half of the known world at that time. And if they don't get it right, that's it. It's done. We won't be here today. The Islamic civilization, Muslim civilization wouldn't be here today. So here, can you imagine it? A sitting sultan, a sitting prime minister, a sitting president deciding to allow himself to be arbitrated, meaning Ali. And, you know, the result of the tahkim arbitration is that both, you know, I mean, basically, you know, remove, you know, they surrender their office, and there should be another vote again to see who should be the new caliph. Of course, as they say, the rest is history. Because, you know, one was more cunning than the other, and I will not go down there. Right? And of course, unfortunately, the followers of Ali were very upset that he allowed himself to be arbitrated, because they believe in Ali's divine right to rule, just like when King Charles I, you know, had the English Civil War, and his followers would believe in him, in his divine right to rule. And imagine it, if in the Roundheads and the Cavaliers, you know, and the Roundheads, of course, won in the English Civil War, but if, let's say, the Cavaliers, the followers of King Charles, had won that war, or, you know, they would have been very, very upset, because in this case, Imam Ali almost won the war, and Muawiyah almost lost the war. You know, lost the battle of Siffin, for instance. But imagine if King Charles's followers had agreed to, you know, for King Charles to step down, they will rebel. So this is the psychology behind why what are later called the extremist Muslims, the Khawarij, the Kharijah, those who seceded, those who came out of Islam. Because why? They ended up being upset with Ali, and they ended up killing Ali. They tried to kill Muawiyah radiallahu anhu and the rest, but they didn't die. So when Ali died, of course, this is the Muslim Game of Thrones. Muawiyah, the pretender, was left. He ended up being the fifth caliph. And the important thing here is that, do you know who really arbitrated, the real arbitrator, the one who really solved this problem, this dispute resolution? It wasn't really the two arbitrators, Abu Musa Al-Ashari or Amr ibn al-As. You know, it was Hassan radiallahu anhu, the grandson of the Prophet, the son of Ali Karamallahu Wajhah radiallahu anhuma. Because when Muawiyah ascended the throne after, by default, the death of Ali, through the assassination of Ali, through the extremist Muslims at that time, the Kharijite, the Khawarij. And unfortunately today, there are Muslims who act like that. You know, they kill other Muslims or other people, they think, because they think these are not believers. So that's why sometimes, ISIS or Al-Qaeda are known as the modern Kharijites. Be careful of their theology. So when Muawiyah ascended the throne, Hassan, people looked to him to take up the mantle of Ali to fight Muawiyah, but he did not do so. And he, basically agreed to, the new, to take an oath of allegiance to the new caliph. And this is an amazing story in the whole history of Islam because of this. Why? This is arbitration miraculously by default. The Prophet, peace be upon him, in a Sahih hadith, famously said about his grandson, he was still young, like a baby, kind of a toddler, when the Prophet was at the pulpit, he said what? Ibni hadha sayyid wa ala Allah an yusliha bihi baina fi'aitaini minal muslimin. This is hadith sahih narrated by Abu Bakr radhiyallahu anhu. Abu Bakr, not Abu Bakr, Abu Bakr radhiyallahu anhu. In this sahih hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, in Sahih Muslim, the Prophet says, this child of mine, meaning Hassan radhiyallahu anhu, the son of Ali, this child of mine, inshallah will one day become a great leader, a Sayyid. Why? Wala'alla Allah. Perhaps Allah will make a resolution, will make peace, will make islah, a peace through him between two great Muslim factions, two great Muslim groups, referring of course to the group of Ali and those who supported him, the rightful caliph at the time, and the pretender Muawiyah. And there is wisdom behind this story, because why? Even though those, especially among our Shia brothers and sisters, they are still Muslims, by the way. We must not make takfir of them. They are still Muslims. Even though Sunni majority Muslims may consider them to be disobedient and on, but they are still Muslims according to Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So even when the Shia Muslims disagree with Muawiyah, they do not like him, but look, after he became caliph, he ruled for the next 10 years through the agreement of Hassan radiallahu anhu, the grandson of the Prophet, whom the Shia also regard him as an imam later on, right? And Muawiyah not only defeated the navy of the Byzantine Roman Empire in the Battle of Mars out of Cyprus, by which time the Mediterranean became a Muslim lake. They could even then lay siege on Constantinople for the first time, although it was not successful. And the Muslims did not take Constantinople until the time of the famous Ottoman Sultan Muhammad II, Sultan Al-Fatih. So for 10 years, it brought prosperity to the Muslim world, that stability, that peace. So ladies and gentlemen, just for us to reflect, I don't have any exclusive insight here other than the insight from this verse of the Quran. MashaAllah. For us to reflect on, Ya Allah, what is it that makes this arbitration an alternative dispute resolution? It's not a conventional dispute resolution. It is alternative. It is for those reasons that I mentioned. Right? That you can choose your judge. You can be faster. And it can be confidential. But if you can't choose your judge, and if it's going to take, long time, just like a conventional litigation, and if it's going to be in a public court, well, you are betraying the original reasons why Tahkim became very popular in the first place. Let us be reminded of this insights from the Muslim tradition, where we can bridge between tradition and modernity from those examples from our Islamic legal tradition there. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, may this, short but hopefully sweet but direct reflection of that most beautiful verse of the Quran. And I will end again with that, mashallah, beautiful verse of the Quran. If you anticipate, وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ شِكَاكَ بَيْنَهِمَا, right? If you anticipate dispute between the two parties, then what do? فَبَعَثُوا حَكَمًا مِنْ أَهْلِهِ وَحَكَمًا مِنْ أَهْلِهَا. Then appoint a mediator, or an arbitrator from the one party and another from the other party. And this is the key thing. In yurida islaha yuwafiqillahi bainahuma. And if they so wish to reconcile among themselves, then God. And that is the thing about this arbitration. It really depends on the two conflicting, disputing parties that want to truly, sincerely want to seek resolution. Because if they have no will to do that, then you will never get a resolution of that dispute. Then God will restore harmony between them. Indeed, surely, God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is all-knowing and all-aware. وَنَقُولُ قُولِي هَذَا وَاسْتَغْفِرُ اللَّهَ لِي وَلَكُمْ. And may this be of sufficient, inshallah, and may this be enough. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you.